to another remote meeting of the Climate Change Committee. Before we get started, I have to go through all the bits of paperwork or whatever it's called to let everyone know what we're doing. So I hope everyone's familiar with the mechanics. If everyone can stay muted when they're not speaking. I noticed that one member who's usually got a parrot on his shoulder doesn't have today, so that's a sad day. I
can soon go and get one, Chair, if you'd like me to. But I don't have them on for official meetings, so.
Oh, that's okay. If anyone wants to raise a comment, question or a comment, can I ask you to raise your blue hands? I'll be trying to keep an eye on all of that to make sure I see when anyone has something to say. For members of the public looking in, you won't see the little blue hands. I'm sorry about that, but I'll be taking the questions from people and comments in the order in which I see them. What else have I got to say? Oh, remind everyone that the meetings are broadcast live and on YouTube, and to stay in shot at all times, please. Background information on if there's no information about fire alarms and where the facilities are, you should know where all of those are in your own homes. And we have technical officers in the background making sure that everything runs smoothly. And we've got a number of officers here to contribute to the debate, and we will be introducing them and talking to them as we go through the meeting. So I think that's everything. We then go on to declarations of interest. Does anyone want to declare an interest in any of this or having an interest? No? Okay. Yes, Councillor Fisher.
It's not a declaration of interest, it's just an apology. I should be leaving the meeting between 7:15 and 7 on the grounds that I officially become a senior citizen today, and consequently my son has volunteered to take me out for a meal. And it's such a rare event, I'm not missing it.
Blimey, I can say to that. Okay, thank you for that. The next thing we need to do is to approve the minutes. Now, I have to say there are so many sets of minutes here, I'm tempted to say we have to approve the hour. We've got minutes from the meeting in December, a meeting in March, and a meeting last month, I seem to recall. Yes. So can we go through them and just check everyone's happy that what was said is correct? I know some members have changed, but I think most of us here today were at all of those meetings. So if we take the first meeting, which is the 8th of December, where we discussed your commission's reporting and the Climate Commission, is everyone happy that the minutes are a correct representation? Are there any dissenting voices? I don't see any. I should note that as chair, we haven't yet received anything about the work of the Climate Commission. And I hope that that's going to be coming soon, because it's now 6 months down the line. And I think the committee needs an update as to how all of that's going. So can we be confident that officers will make sure that something will come to the next meeting? Is there someone who can take charge of that to make sure that we get a report? I don't know. Is that something that you, Claire, or Sean are aware of and on top of?
Sorry, I couldn't find my unmute button. Yeah, that's fine. Thank you. Yeah, we'll take that. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. And with no other comments, then I'll assume that I can sign those minutes as correct. The next set of minutes are the minutes for the 9th of March this year, where we discussed carbon literacy training and York's tree canopy expansion targets, and started our journey into establishing key performance indicators. Is there anything there that people want to amend or have any comments on? I'm not seeing anything, so I will assume that I'm okay with those as well. And then lastly, the ones I've got here are the minutes of the meeting held in June. Now I'm getting mixed up. I've got too many bits of paper in front of me. Someone prompt me as to where, 29th of June. No, that's when they were published. Maybe
Chair,
I'm
haven't
reading too
seen
many
any-
of these. Sorry?
I haven't seen any minutes from the most recent meeting. Were
Oh,
they
well,
part
that's
of a
okay.
supplementary agenda or?
Okay, maybe I was just running away with myself there. So thanks for that.
Chair,
Rachel.
I think it was just the two sets of minutes. One
Okay.
was seemed to have been published again with the agenda supplement, but it's just the two sets.
Oh, right. Okay, that's why it is. I've just seen the same thing twice then. Okay, thanks for that. Okay, so we've covered minutes then. In which case, we can then move on to public participation. And sorry, yes, Rachel.
I was just going to ask if we know when we will have the minutes from the last meeting, because it included our plans of kind of the time frame of what we're going to scrutinise and when. So it'd be handy to have a record of that for us and in the public domain at some point.
Yes, that's true. Does anyone, Fiona, do you have, or Claire, do you have an answer to that?
Yeah, we'll take that away with us and publish that straight after this meeting, because it's all approved, so we can get that out round to you. That's not a problem.
Good. Okay, thanks for that. So right, public participation.
Oh, sorry, Christian, can I just make a point about the minutes? I was trying to work out what had changed between the minutes that were published in the original pack and in the supplementary agenda pack. Could you just confirm what the change was in between the two? So something has changed in that first paragraph, but I can't quite work out why.
Can I ask Fiona if you know the answer to that one, as they've come from you?
I'm sorry, I don't, Chair, because I took this meeting over at very short notice and I haven't compared the two sets. I don't have them in front of me, but I'll if you want to let me give me a couple of minutes so I can have a look.
It's in the big paragraph that were the minutes of the previous meeting. So they've been changed. The minute of the previous meeting has changed. It's a different length. So
sorry, Councillor One, can you just tell me what number minute you're
so it's
referring
8.
to?
It's those two paragraphs that are number 8 are not identical. And I just wondered why they've been changed and reissued.
Paragraph 8. Let me just check.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not clear what it is either. I think it may just be a pagination thing.
One of them says something about the council maintained its commitment, and the other one says something about the council not changing its commitment. I just wondered what the subtle difference was and why it had to change.
I think that may be on reflection. I think that maybe Councillor Baker raised that issue. I'm trying to think of whether the Scrutiny Committee had declared that there was a distinction between a zero carbon York and a zero carbon council that we discussed at some length. And the plans that were put in front of us by Sean were about delivering a zero carbon council. And we were talking about the capacity for the council to deliver a zero carbon council. And we rehearsed the fact that we didn't think, and I think it was generally agreed, that it wasn't in the council's gift to deliver a zero carbon York, because that involves many stakeholders. But that we hadn't in that meeting said that the council had abandoned the ambition to have a zero carbon York. We had simply stated the case that we thought the council could deliver a zero carbon council.
Thank you. That makes sense, because the word York has been inserted as well. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
I think that's the distinction. Okay. And assuming that's all right with everyone, then I will move now to public participation. And thanks for that comment, Derek, and for helping us to tidy that up. So we've got 4 public speakers today. We've got, the first one is Debbie Cobbett, who's going to, a local resident, who's going to address some of the agenda items in today's meeting. Debbie, you've got 3 minutes to address us. And I hope that's all okay.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello, good. Thank you. It was good to learn from the papers for today that you are conducting a big conversation with residents, because I haven't received our city magazine since the meeting in March, or heard about it through any other channels such as York Festival of Ideas. And even from your homepage, it took a bit of scrolling and clicking to find it. And I soon understood why a friend had almost spontaneously self-combusted when completing it. Lots of fiddly questions, many of which not applicable to me, though this option was rarely given. I persisted because, as you people know, I'm persistent and very interested in all of this. But I did wonder how many other people will do so. And I was quite surprised that the only question about the impacts of climate change came suddenly in the middle, and that there was nothing to assess our knowledge, our level of knowledge, just our anxiety, and I wondered how that would help. Another friend thinks that she's received the paper questionnaire twice, and she says she completed one and threw the other one away. And her worry is what will happen to people with gas at home. Her gas boiler was replaced last month and has a 10-year warranty. And going all electric seems so basic that this should be on the agenda, surely. I think a big conversation involves debate and discussion, as my MP in Sheffield used to do. We knocked on doors, we asked people about their priorities, we ran meetings throughout September every year, all over the city with different groups, and I feel that was more like engaging with the public. And I still think on the Climate Commission, disappointing that you haven't heard from them, I still think you need employees there as well as managers and more businesses, and find out and share what local businesses have done to cut emissions. And that could be part of a learning process and a big conversation for everybody, and perhaps address this Zero Carbon York, Zero Carbon Council issue that you've been talking about. The other thing in the minutes, by the way, was that Rachel Melly and a few other people were not listed as attending in March. About the roadmap, I've still got lots of questions. The lack of detailed plans for creating jobs and training people and engaging with schools and colleges about careers advice or apprenticeships and so on. Youth employment is such an urgent issue nationally, and I shared a report with you before. Friends of the Earth have now analysed research by the local government association suggesting that 10 times more jobs could be created in York than the roadmap suggests, over 3,000 rather than 300 odd. Again, this might be to do with whether you're decarbonising York or just yourselves, but you know, I think it needs pushing and it needs scrutiny, and Joseph has the link for that. That's what I wanted to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Debbie. And your notes, there's a patter to all this where I just say your thoughts are going to be taken into consideration. I feel that sometimes that just becomes a mantra that it has substance, but I want to assure you that I can see everyone's listening to this, and I'm very grateful to you for your comments. I now move on to Jeff Beacon, who wants to talk about the general remit of the Climate Change Committee. And you too have 3 minutes, Jeff, and welcome.
Thanks. Thanks, Christian. at your last meeting, the guy from Greenpeace, what was his name, Tom Franklin, argued that you should be sticking to York's declaration of a climate emergency and not just going to the council. I agree with that. If you're going to get rid of or oppose York's declaration, then that ought to be done through a rescinding motion at council and done publicly as well. And I'd like to point out that the Leeds University study that Sean Gibbons mentioned in December has York's carbon emissions as 4.3, I think it is, tonnes a person. 4.23 tonnes of CO2 per person per year in York. Well, another group at Leeds do the DEFRA figures, and that's coming out for the UK as 10.5 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent a person. And the Stockholm Institute's study on Derwentthorpe said that York's yearly carbon emissions were 14.3 tonnes per citizen in 2015. Now, I find this all very confusing. And the other thing I find confusing is that the Tyndall Centre study that was done before the Leeds study has been dismissed because the carbon budget was prior to the IPPCC, that is, expanded the global carbon budget, and that was mostly done by some of our scientists. I don't think that's true. It doesn't seem to me, reading the Tyndall report, that they used old pre-SR15, IPC SR15 figures. So I'd like an explanation of why the Tyndall report was binned and another one was commissioned. That's if the council did commission both of those, which seems plausible. And I know this is an incredibly difficult political problem, and politically, the declaration of a climate emergency is almost impossible from a political point of view. But it's maybe that those targets may be necessary from a physical climate change point of view. So I've got a lot of sympathy with what I see as backtracking that Tom, the Greenpeace guy pointed out, Tom Franklin pointed out. Can I just
get you to wind up, Jeff, just to let you know?
Yeah, the basic thing is that there's a lot of confusion here, which ought to be ironed out with education. And if we're going to if you're going to get rid of the climate emergency declaration, make it a bit more high profile and go back to council and say, we can't possibly do this. Thanks, Christian.
Thank you.
And the rest of you.
Jeff. Thank you for your comments, and we'll be referring to those later on, I'm sure, as I said earlier. So we now move on to our third speaker, Penny Bainbridge, who's chair of the York Environment Forum. Penny, welcome, and you too have 3 minutes.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks, Christian. Good evening. Yes, I'm the chair of York Environment Forum, and I'd like to tell you about York Environment Week 21, and I'm going to mention how it's relevant to the agenda topic you're talking about in a little while, which is about the Residents' Engagement Plan. Well, York Environment Week is having its second week. In September this year, we had the first one in November and December of 2020. The week this year is going to be called # York Acts Together Tackling Climate Change. and we're aspiring to have at least 30 events, all held on a not-for-profit basis, and they'll be presented and organised by residents groups, green groups, etc. The exact dates that we've got for the week is starting on the 18th of September and going through to the 26th of September, so it takes in 2 weekends. All of the events that are going to take place are going to be fitting into the theme of acting locally to tackle climate change. I believe that this week I'm talking about supports York City Council's aims that are in the engagement plan, which is to engage with the public in order to bring about an ambitious and achieve the inspiring aim of achieving net zero carbon emissions by 2030. The reason why I think that is that residents who attend the events will learn a lot, they'll develop greater knowledge about climate change issues, and be more motivated to take action that are going in the right direction in reaching the net zero target. So what I'm really asking is that for this to be a success, we're calling on our allies like yourselves to promote York Environment Week so that we can get a really good turnout from local residents. We've currently got a call for events going out, so we're accepting submissions at the moment, and then we'll start publicising them towards probably the beginning of August and promote everything through the York Environment Week website. So I hope that's enough for now, and we'll be keeping in touch with local councillors and lots of other stakeholders about how things are going. So thanks for listening. I just wanted to say I can't stay right to the end of the meeting because we've got Edible York meeting later on, so I need to get off to that quite soon. Anyway, thanks for listening.
Thank you very much. And again, we are paying attention to all of this, and you've raised a number of important issues there relating to communications with residents that I'm sure we will be picking up, Penny. The last person we're going to hear from is June Tranmere, who's going to give us an update on what One Planet York have been doing since we last heard from One Planet York, which memory serves was about a year ago. June, hi, you've got 3 minutes. Are you there, June? Can you hear us? Does any of the technical team know if June is still there or if we've kind of lost her?
I believe we just got her on now.
Ah, good.
Memory serves us about a year ago. Hi, you've got 3 minutes. Hi, yes, it's been a while.
Good.
You can hear me all right?
We can now hear you, yes.
Yeah. Are you there, June? I am here.
Yep, you're free to speak.
Yes.
Chair,
Yes.
I think the speaker might be watching the meeting on YouTube.
Oh, right. I need to stop the YouTube thing. Okay.
Yeah, then we'll be able to hear you better,
Yeah,
hopefully.
that's it.
Yeah.
That's better. Sorry, I was listening on YouTube. Yeah, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, thank you. It has been a long year, has it not? We've been September. It was September last year when we had our revitalization event, and that was a dramatic kind of the globe was brought out, and we had several meetings in New York Environment Week, which we have saved on our YouTube channel, so they're there for people to see. We had Mike Berners-Lee come and talk about how bad are bananas. We had a large number of participants, which was really nice. And we've now got 36 members. We've become a CIC. We've got a bank account. we've got a lot more of a plan, really, of where we're going. That's what we've been doing. We've not been doing nothing while we've been quiet. We've been quite busy as much as we can be, given that we're all volunteers. But yeah, mainly we got a group of directors together. We got registers at Companies House, and then it took quite some work to get a bank account. But I won't bore you with that. But we're in now. We've got a nice bank account, so we're ready to receive funding. So our members are going to be giving us their subscriptions, and we've got people trained, some of them in carbon literacy. But also, what I want to do is get a number of our members trained with the bioregional training, which covers all the 10 principles of One Planet Living, because that's, for us, there's more to sustainability than just focusing on carbon. Although carbon reaches through all the 10 principles, we need to make sure that all the other things are covered. Now, not all businesses are going to want to talk about land use and wildlife, or economy and equity and things like that. So we're starting with a few basics, and we've got a few businesses lined up, have joined, and they're working on their own sustainability policies. And so we're quite excited about the way going forward. We are representing ourselves on the sustainability group that Claire and Sean have started off, and that's very exciting, because I think it is more action based, because we are actually about getting on with things, really, rather than, we spent a lot of time talking for the first few years of One Planet York's existence, and now it's about action. So we're very keen to participate in York Environment Week, as Penny's just mentioned. We've got a proposal which kind of links in with this idea of a climate emergency centre. We're very keen to be part of a consortium of organizations that would like to have a pop-up place. I've walked around town and I've found 18 premises, that any of which could be suitable. So I'm sure one of them might be the right place. So we have to work out who owns which premises and how we can get an arrangement, and then look at the funding, look at the costs, get it all costed out, and get some funding to get people trained, and then we can provide a center in the city center where people can come in on an individual basis and pick up information, because that's what we're about as well, talking to individuals. But we are also going to go and visit the workplaces and help people and gather the data. That's what we're aiming to do, is gather the data. So we've got an idea of where people are on this path that we're going to reduce our carbon footprints and increase our sustainability. So, I mean, I think the last thing I want to say probably is I'm very pleased to see the potential restriction of sky lanterns in this agenda today. And I would urge you to get going with that, because they are the most horrendous things. And I can see there's some usual council speak going on in there about, oh, but it's going to upset people, and oh, but it's going to be too difficult, and oh, but. But really, it really needs doing. So, and I'd just like to mention that Colombia is spelt with an O, not a U, if you're talking about Colombia in South America, which I believe you might be. So, sorry, a bit pedantic, but anyway, nevertheless. Okay. Thank you very much for listening. Lovely to see you all again. Bye.
Thank you very much, June. And you've raised a number of things there. And it's particularly heartening, I have to say, as chair, and I'm sure the others will feel the same way, that you've come up with so many positive, proactive things you want to be busy doing. And that's really great to hear. And we will be discussing that as we move on to the whole issue of communications. So my thanks to all the speakers, and you're all welcome, obviously, to sit and listen to the rest of proceedings. So that's that bit. So 4 very interesting speakers, I have to say, with useful points that I think contribute to the discussion we've got to have now. So we now move on to the next 2 items, the substance of our meeting. The next item being Climate Change Resident Engagement Plan, which fits in quite neatly with various of the things we've heard just now. and I'm sure will resonate with some of the points that members would like to make. So I don't know who wants to be presenting it. Is it Sean or is it Claire? I'm not sure.
If I introduce it, then I'll hand over to Sean to sort of pick up, walk through it. So thank you, Chair. Thank you, speakers. Lots in there. I'll speak broadly at the moment to introduce the piece, but we might pick up on some of those points later on as we go through the discussion, because certainly there's lots we can pick up on there. So thank you. Just to introduce the Climate Change Resident Engagement Plan. This plan is to support the development of the climate change strategy, which, as you know, Sean Gibbons is onto. It falls in line, or it lines with the resident engagement strategy that was discussed and approved at executive in April. And the same resident engagement strategy is informing the resident engagement plans for both the local transport plan and the economic development strategy, and of course the climate change strategy. And we've deliberately brought all three key strategic themes together because of their interdependencies. Indeed, one of your speakers today, Debbie Colbert, she actually mentioned something about jobs and the economy, which is really interesting how she's actually picked up on that as a key theme herself. So it actually recognises the importance of bringing those three things together. We have already started the resident engagement work. We've already had nearly 500 people complete the online survey, and as we've heard, people are completing the offline survey that we'll bring together. We review the participation every couple of weeks to make sure we get a reasonable split across the city, so location-wide, age-wide, gender-wise, and also socioeconomic groups, so how people are, whether they're working or not working, what their kind of circumstances are, to try and get as fair representation as possible. We're also working very closely with different community groups, and we've got a meeting with the LGBTQ forum shortly. We're going to one of their coffee mornings to talk about how to get involved. And I'll leave it to Sean to pick up on more details and walk through the presentations, but we look forward to hearing your questions shortly. So thank you very much. Over to Sean.
Yes, Sean.
Thanks, Claire. That's a great introduction. So as Claire mentioned, that the climate change engagement plan, the first couple of phases are really focused around supporting the development of the climate change strategy. And the very first phase of the climate change resident engagement plan is a public attitude survey through the mechanism of Our Big Conversation. The climate change strategy will be for the whole city, and it's really important that we hear the views of our residents and businesses, what they think of climate change, to feed into the development of that strategy. So Our Big Conversation was launched on the 18th of June, and it will run until the 31st of July over a number of mediums, both online and physical responses from residents and businesses also through that. The second phase of the resident engagement strategy is a number of stakeholder roundtables. These will be thematic across the topics of buildings, transport, energy and waste, and cover the vast majority of emissions from across the city, and will similarly inform the content and development of the climate change strategy. It's expected that the climate change strategy will have a draft of that ready in August, and then we'll go back through another process of public consultation to provide comments and feedback on that draft strategy. That's as far as the detailed resident engagement plan for climate change gets us at the moment, but we do acknowledge future phases of the work that will be more focused around informing and providing our residents with useful information for how they can reduce their own carbon footprint as we move into phase 3 of the engagement plan.
Thank you, Sean. That's very helpful. That's a good introduction. I have lots of things to say. I always do. Most of us do, politicians. I'm keen to get other people's thoughts first. So yes, Rachel, dive in.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you for providing so much information and so much detail. I found it really helpful and also reassuring to see how much thought's gone into it. And I'm really pleased to hear you say that you're kind of monitoring what responses there are as you go along. I think in general there tends to be more responses towards the end of the time period, doesn't there? People tend to leave stuff towards the deadline. It takes time for people to hear about it and then do their own thinking and fill it in and stuff, doesn't it? So I'm concerned that we might get to the end of the time period and then realise that there maybe isn't a huge variety in terms of demographics, age range, that sort of thing. And I had a look at kind of how you're targeting different people. And when it comes to age, there was quite a lot in there about people 16 and under 16, 16 to 24, 24 to 30. And I couldn't really see much at all about any other age groups. And I am concerned that I know there are efforts such as sending things out in the post, but in general, most of this is being done online. It's being promoted through social media, online workshops, that sort of thing. I'm concerned that we won't get kind of an accurate representation of wider age groups. The only reference that I could see to people maybe a bit older was, sorry, I'll find it now, something like Age Friendly Forum. I don't really know what that is. There's Age Friendly York, but that's a council initiative. It's not independent of the council.
So do you want me to come into that, or
yeah,
wait?
yeah.
So Age Friendly York is a council initiative with around about 100 people of a certain age, if you like, who are helping inform that programme. So they're self-selected volunteers, if you like, who've joined the programme to help make sure that the needs of the older population actually roll out, if you like, into the age-friendly city that we want it to be. We're also working with the Old Age Assembly, so getting out through to them. And as you note, the household leaflet, Our City, has gone to all households, so hopefully we'll catch some people there. Now that restrictions are actually shifting as well, we've actually got the opportunity to do something a bit more. So we're dropping postcards into community centres, into libraries, into more physical environments so that people can pick them up as they go about their business. And we're working with and looking to see how we can actually go to different face-to-face meetings, so working potentially with ward members, with community groups, etc., to see whether we can now join their own meetings that are actually restarting again as restrictions lift. So I hope that helps reassure. But you're absolutely right. We do need one of the reasons we monitor participation every couple of weeks is because we're constantly looking at making sure there's a fair spread across the age ranges. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Yes, and I think at a previous meeting we mentioned the need to be involving people like the York Racial Equality Network and trades unions and faith groups and all the others. So I'm hoping they're also all on the radar. Yes, so I'll move on to Anna. You've got your hand up.
Yes, Chair. Thank you. I've got a couple of questions, if that's okay. So the first one relates to point 40 around bringing key audiences together to sort of understand each other's been explore the responses, and I'd really like to know sort of more about how that's going to work, as I think sort of younger people have generally driven this agenda, haven't they? And I'm aware that they're not necessarily on the climate they would have liked, and I suppose bring together interested in less knowledge potentially about it, because I'd just like to know a little bit more about how you get everybody to understand the differing points of view. Next question, sorry, is on page 16. So I was just having a look at the strategy presentation, and I noticed that the stage 3 sort of consultation was there, and they did that because around the implementation we sort of get across what is in the draft strategy rather than consulting on what should go into the strategy. Is that why it's not sort of elaborated upon yet as to what that will involve? And if I can make just a final point, sorry, this isn't another question, but it was just another group that I think useful to the stakeholder is because obviously if we're going to be encouraging people to start learning new skills, and we're basing out things like GASP, unions are obviously going to be rightly concerned about people with those skills and how we make that transition without judging anyone. So I think they're an important voice as part of this discussion too. Sorry, I bombarded you with questions there.
Okay, that's fine. Who would like to respond first? So I go to you, Claire, and then
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm sorry, Councillor Perry, I only caught some of that, so I'm going to feed back the questions as I think I heard them. But if I'm mistaken, please do let me know. So I think your first question was, how are we going to sort of hear from all the different perspectives and help people understand different points of view rather than necessarily take different agendas and stick to them. So that's the point that comes out in point number, oh, I don't know, in the paper. Was that right?
It was, yeah, sorry, point 14.
Point 14.
I've got an unstable apology if I'm in and out.
Yeah, just a little bit. I'll try and catch it though. So yeah, thank you. So we're learning from the work that we've done on a different project entirely. So My Castle Gateway and My York Central, which actually deliberately exposes some of those different opinions to create debate amongst residents themselves. So mostly on social media, but we're also looking at how we might do that in a workshop or in a on a face-to-face engagement activity where we have a discussion. So one of the speakers actually spoke earlier about a conversation is a discussion, and now restrictions are lifted. We're looking at how we can have those discussions in a more face-to-face environment. But yeah, we very much want to show that there are different perspectives, and it's not a singular agenda. Everybody's got a very different view, and you're right, sometimes those views are polarized, and we'll be using quite different ways that we can cut the data to try and understand whether different groups share particular views or whether actually those views themselves are very, they're shared equally across different audiences, and there is no particular group that support one particular view. And it will be a balance, of course it will. So there will be trade-offs, and we'll need to be quite open about what those trade-offs are and what people are telling us, and what kind of decisions we've had to make as a result. So that's the perspectives one. I think the second question was about stage 3, about whether we can, the reason we haven't yet shared the detail of the engagement is because we haven't really got to stage 3 yet, in terms of we haven't yet drafted the climate change strategy. Was that right? Was that the question?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. So that's your absolute.
Because it didn't appear later on, so I just wondered whether or not that was because it was just, an evolving conversation and we didn't have the sort of action plan and how we would implement it.
Yeah, Sean, that's one for you, but I mean, you're absolutely right, Councillor Perrett.
Yes, Sean.
Yeah, I don't feel like I can or have to elaborate on that. Yeah, that's absolutely the case. Stage 3 will evolve once we have a bit more information of what's in the strategy, what type of information we will need to be providing to residents, and how we will be presenting that information. So yeah, more info to come.
And then finally from me, Councillor Perrett, you gave the name of an organisation towards the end, and I didn't catch the organisation. I wonder if you could just repeat it.
It was just trade unions.
Trade unions.
In general.
Yeah.
Trade unions, yes, they'll represent then be sub-ban.
Yeah, we'll discuss it with trade unions, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you.
I can see, is that a legacy hand, or are you still, is that a hand for another question, Rachel?
No, I raised my hand again. No, officers are very on the ball with putting hands down once we've asked our questions.
Oh, right,
There's
okay.
a new hand. Yeah. It was about, there's a few times in this report where all this engagement is referred to as a resident engagement plan. And obviously I think it's very important that residents have a huge, a big say over what happens in their city. And residents' voices should be centred over people outside the city. But obviously people in York care very much about reducing carbon emissions. They care about our city and it being a greener city. So, and if people are coming in from outside the city and causing carbon emissions, I think it's important to understand what and how. And I'm just wondering what's in the plan for talking to people from outside the city and how they decide to travel to the city, how they decide what to do, where to go, where to stay, how to travel when they're here as well. So I was just wondering if there's anything to do with that in the plan.
Shall I pick that one up, Sean? Yeah.
Yep, go ahead.
Yep. So, so the RB conversation is addressing the local transport plan requirements as well, and the attitudes and barriers and the opportunities around how people travel through and from the city. We're also targeting commuters and employees outside of the city as part of the economic theme of the resident engagement. So it's really important to us that we actually hear from as wider voices as possible in and outside of the city, and we're targeting those groups who don't traditionally live in the city through our networks essentially. So we're working very closely with the head of communications group who reach far beyond the city, the local enterprise partnership, the obviously the universities, higher education, etc., so that we don't just target those people with a YO postcode or those with a YO postcode within the council boundaries, but we look beyond that. Hospital, that's another people we're working with, and obviously their staff come from far and wide. So yeah, we're very keen on the voices and the perspectives of people who use the city but don't necessarily live here.
That's good to hear. And I'll just put something in there as well, because I know Rachel and I have both sat on the informal all-party transport group, partnership, whatever it is, and issues such as an electric shuttle bus in the city centre have been raised, which is something they've got in Dijon and runs every 10 minutes all day. Plainly, that would have some value for local residents, but equally for tourists and visitors to get around the city, and people with mobility problems, and so on and so on and so on. So it's very clear that the discussion does need to be as wide as possible in order to be able to get a proper sense of what is needed and how it might work. I've seen, I'll go first to Stuart and then come back to you, or is it a further point on that issue?
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, I think it's not just about transport, it's what sort of activities, what people choose to do and what they eat and where they eat, and it's everything. It's how people see the city, how people plan their visits and what they consider, where they look, what sort of research they do, what kind of decisions they make, and why. Obviously transport is a huge part of that, traveling to the city and then within the city when they're here, but I think it's everything, not just transport.
Yeah, I'd agree with that 100%. I'm sure I think everyone would. Before I pass on to Stuart, there's a couple of other things I'd like to say, but in relation to what the speakers have said earlier on. I've certainly made no secret of the fact that I was disappointed by the way the survey was structured and some of the questions that were being asked. And in particular, I know I raised the issue of, if you ask a question, are you willing to use your car less? You're likely to get a response that is maybe not going to lead down to a path of finding solutions, but is going to make people feel anxious and defensive and worried. And I think our first speaker, Debbie, put her finger on that, didn't she, when she talked about the way the survey was structured, and that she felt it triggered anxiety rather than helping to spread knowledge. And so I think she made that point very well, and then talked about debate and discussion. And then I was heartened that from that, we then heard Penny Bainbridge say, we're running an event, it's going to last for 10 days. We'd like the City Council to support us. And then we heard June for One Planet York saying the same thing and saying, could we have a pop-up shop? And all those contributions actually lifted my spirits to see that we're not alone here. And if we can harness that enthusiasm and passion that exists beyond the council and act as a catalyst to bring that together, the quality of this conversation can only improve. And so I hope that we're going to find ways of making sure we can support what those two organisations are doing, precisely to expand that conversation and to make sure that we're giving the public information that helps them understand how action to create a zero carbon future can come about, rather than asking them consciously or unconsciously to parade their anxieties about where we are. So I just wanted to make that comment because I think the speakers all had very useful points to make on that. I don't know if officers want to comment on that before I go to Stuart.
Yeah, happy to, Chair. I think it's a really interesting point. And one of the things that we were really conscious about doing in the first stage of resident engagement was getting an unfiltered view of public attitude when it comes to climate change, without that kind of leading questioning, leading information. And I think it's really interesting to find out that actually some of those ideas presented can create some element of anxiety in our residents, or some residents are anxious about some of the challenges that we're faced with carbon reduction. And that's something that's really great information. I think obviously it's not great that they feel anxious about that, but it's great information for us to be able to structure the latter phases of our communication that will focus more on knowledge transfer and motivating residents to change their behaviours. Also, just to pick on your point about York Environment Week, the council will be supporting that. We're looking at a series of events that we can run as part of York Environment Week. Really pleased to say that we will be supporting that as well.
Good, thank you very much for that. I'll move on to Stuart.
Yeah, thanks, Chair, and thanks to officers for the report as well. So I've picked up on one point within this, which for me speaks to the most important thing. And I suppose my fear is that it gets a really brief mention, and then it's kind of lost when it comes to the objectives section. Is the point on page 23 of our pack, among the core questions, where you talk about asking people about barriers and enablers. And I suppose I always come across as a bit of a kind of cynic. I think these engagement pieces are good. It's great to mobilise enthusiasm, brilliant. But, you know, if we're talking climate emergency, for me, it's about, you know, what practical kind of actions are going to come out the back of this, to cut straight to, you know, the binary. And I think that point you've got on page 23 about the barriers and enablers is really key, because there's, you know, in all swathes of life, there are individuals, companies and other organizations who want to do things. They know that they might be the right things to do, but they face, you know, practical barriers that stand in their way, whether that's finance, whether it's you know, regulation, health and safety. And I think if we could really kind of try and bring the evidence gathered around those barriers and enablers out, and kind of begin to say, look, you know, having identified these barriers and enablers, here are the actors who need to be involved in devising the solution, whether that's central government, whether it's us with central government, whether it's business community, whether it's individuals. I'd just like to see a bit more emphasis on this idea of, you know, barriers, enablers, actors, solutions.
Yeah, well made point there. And I suppose to develop from that, maybe throw this for debate. I'm certainly of the belief that as part of enabling, as you're saying it there, Stuart, is that if we're going to be able to create a low carbon future for all those things that are to do with, for example, leisure in the city for residents and visitors, we need to have a discussion about what those kind of leisure opportunities could be. And for me, the way I see it is very much contextualized by what I see in other European countries, where cities make a point of creating an environment park as part of their local plan, so that residents at weekends don't have to get into a car to have a good day out. They can do it by a large, 50-hectare site with water, sports and camping and restaurants that you can cycle to, and to actually think in terms of those broader things that will enable us to live a low carbon lifestyle, rather than just beating ourselves over the head that we've got to stop using so much carbon. So there's very much a positive planning aspect to all of this, to create the future that we can all enjoy and live lower carbon lives in. And I hope that in the further stages of this consultation, will be talking with residents about what kind of things they would like to do if they could closer to York. What what leisure opportunities would they like to be a part of? Do they think that could happen in the city? How would it work? What would they need for it to happen? So this kind of blue sky stuff that we're having at the moment, that first stage, which is asking people how comfortable they are and what they know, as you've both explained, Sean and Claire. I think going down, it's giving people that opportunity to start to dream. This is the city I would live in. This is where I want to be with my city going forwards. And I think that's broadly what you're saying as well, isn't it, Stuart? It's kind of separating out what will enable that future to come to life. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think you need to start with a vision and then understand what the barriers to that are. It's a bit like the kind of process of road mapping. You know, if you've got destination point A, what are the steps along route that need to be addressed to get there?
Can I ask then of officers, what you think you'll need from members, and whether you think that the Climate Change Committee has a part to play in this, to help create this vision? Because what seems to me to stop local authorities from achieving so often is that we all know what we don't like, we all know where we shouldn't be. It's how do we articulate positive visions that residents, stakeholders, businesses can embrace and talk about in order to move forwards? And where do we get those visions that set us free from simply thinking about it's not working, we're not happy, we etc. Both Claire and Sean, I'd just like to have your thoughts as to where you think that's going to come from, and whether you think we've got a part to play in this, and where you think the democratic process and members have a part to play.
Shall I start and then you finish, Sean? Shall we do a tag team? So yes, all right. So obviously we're taking very much a if you like, a grassroots approach. So we are deliberately starting with residents and their perspectives, and you're right, we're looking at it from a barriers and enablers. What is preventing you from living your best life that you can in the city? But at the moment, not what are the solutions or what is the vision, but literally what are the current circumstances that surround you? And we're looking at it not just from the economic, the local transport plan and the climate change perspective. We're also, remember, at the same time running the My City Centre engagement process, the York Central engagement process, the Castle Gateway design process. So all of these different things are happening. We're also, from a council budget perspective, just about to start the budget process. So that'll be sort of kicking off in the autumn. And unlike previous engagement activities that we've held in the council, we're doing these all within the same framework, which, I mean, it's behind the scenes, nobody would ever know, but it means that we can actually cut data in such a way that we'll better understand the kind of things that are troubling residents, that are those barriers or those opportunities. And alongside that, we're having multiple conversations with multiple different stakeholder groups. So Sean's outlined the different stakeholders that we're talking to in terms of the climate change work. So for transport, I'm going to get this wrong, housing, transport and energy. Those roundtables are taking place over the next, so July and August really, so the next sort of few weeks. Alongside that, we have regular stakeholder conversations with the business community, with the health community. Oh, everything's changed. The health community, all those different stakeholders, just to try and create a picture of what are our opportunities. And then alongside all of that, I'm working very closely in my new role to help shape the 10-year plan, which we're working with city leaders on. So city leaders are currently being interviewed around exactly the same thing. What are the challenges? What are the opportunities? What are the barriers? What are preventing your institution being the best it can be to help us all live fair and sustainable lives in the city? And all of that is going to be coming together in the autumn, which is a huge amount of insight and feedback from a huge number of different participants that we hope will be able to synthesize into some kind of compelling, inspiring and overarching vision that will set out principles for how we actually live in the city over the next 10 years to get us to carbon neutrality, but also to get our economy up and thriving again, to get our to make sure that we can reduce some of the health inequalities across the city, that we can better support education inequalities, tackle what is coming, the mental health crisis that we all know about as a result of COVID. So it's a whole holistic approach to building what will be a huge strategic narrative for us going forward. But right now, all we're doing is gathering the insight. We're just doing lots and lots of listening. When we get to autumn, that's when we'll be kind of consolidating it. And I haven't got your work plan to hand in front of me, but I do know that we're coming back to you at different stages with different levels of insight and sharing with you what people are telling us to give you the opportunity to kind of explore that in more depth. I think the next one, I mean, Christian, you might, Councillor Vassy, you might have it. I think the next one next meeting we've got with you, we're talking about what all that insight is telling us, I think.
I think so. I don't have the data
No.
either. So, but yes, I'm sure it is coming back. So yes.
Sean, did you want to carry off?
No, I think you've done an excellent job there, Claire, of summarising and the vision, like you say, is climate change, carbon reduction isn't the only challenge that we face as a city, and taking a holistic approach to what we want York to be, I think is the best way forward. But there are principles, there are things we need to incorporate within our climate change strategy, like making sure that it's fair and inclusive, making sure that it builds strong, sustainable communities, it creates new employment and investment opportunities, it focuses on improving health and well-being. All of these are part of the vision that will be incorporated within the climate change strategy.
Thank you, that's great. And I have, as usual, more to say, but I'm not going to say anything. I'm going to pass on to Tony and then Anna.
Thanks, Chair. Page 27, I noticed under the wider audience map, schools have cropped up there, and I think schools are an incredibly fertile area for getting involvement, not just because I have discovered, as you know, I was a teacher for hundreds of years. One of the things I used to do was very often try and get work on climate change introduced to parents through kids. One of the things we used to do was teaching year 9 on insulation of houses. I'd ask the kids to do a report on their own home and how insulation could be improved in the house, and give it to the parents. Say, look, I won't mark it, give it to your parents, let them mark it. And believe it or not, one kid came in and said, I got 25 quid for that report, because my dad realised how much I could actually, or my mum and dad realised how much they could save. And I mean, I've spoken to the older generation about climate change. Some of them's view is, doesn't bother me, I'll be dead before it's a problem. Young people don't have that position because they know within their lifespans climate change is going to affect them dramatically. And I really wonder if there's some kind of events, and I'd be very happy to do some of these because, having been a teacher, I'd be very happy to go into schools and lead things if that was required. We need to get into schools as much as we can and engage with kids, because they're the future generation. They care about climate change probably more than any other individual group.
That's a really kind offer. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Tony. And unless Claire or Sean want to respond more, I will move on to Anna.
What you've described, Councillor Fisher, is kind of stage 2 when we're in the autumn. Right now, we need to get young people to complete the survey. So we're on to that, and we'll come back to you in the autumn when we're shaping out our stage 2 and what we might need to do around that. So thank you.
Sorry, jumping ahead of the gun as usual.
No, don't worry.
Yeah, I mean, it's about 18 months ago, I remember the Climate Change Committee was having meetings and talking about the campaigning that young people were doing on climate change as we were having our meetings, going around the streets. One of my daughters was involved in it. We invited one of the participants to sit on our committee. I think all of that still needs to happen, and needs to happen more than ever. So I think the point is well made, Tony, and I hope that we find a way of bringing that together. Anna, you wanted to come back.
Thanks, Chair. Going to as I was advised to do that while webcasting, and Hopefully this will help and you'll be able to actually hear me a little bit better now. Sorry for having to turn the video. Thing you said, Claire, about it being sort of grassroots led, it's sort of built on, because I did spot that there are already priority areas. Point 24, we've got a few priorities set out, and I suppose it's how set in stone is anything like that. If residents coming back to us and giving us completely different priorities, are we going to review that for the stage 2 when we're having the round tables? Because one of them that I think wasn't there that will probably come up and be quite prominent is biodiversity and you know, green spaces and what role that offsetting and insetting is going to have. So is it all up for grabs? And if people come with different concerns, will you be taking that into account?
Yeah, absolutely, definitely. Nothing is set in stone. There are a well documented set of actions that councils have already taken, but we're also open to being innovative and trying new things as well. So yeah, absolutely open to new suggestions, and whatever comes out of the resident engagement and stakeholder roundtables will be incorporated into the strategy.
So, you know, Anna, because you weren't there at the start of the Climate Change Committee, we made sure that biodiversity is in the remit of this committee. And there was discussion right at the start over whether biodiversity had anything to do with climate change, which I have to say I found rather odd. Ultimately, I don't think that many of us are actually hugely concerned about carbon dioxide per se. We're concerned with what carbon dioxide is doing to our world. And so I think the point you make about biodiversity is well made. And there are other points that may come up as well in terms of civil liberties and human rights that all relate to climate issues as well. So it will be interesting to see how engaged residents and other stakeholders are with these issues. Are there any other comments on the report at this stage, or are we happy? I think we're just being asked to note this report, aren't we, in this context? And hopefully, Claire and Sean, you've had some pointers here that will help inform how we go forwards.
It's been super helpful. Thank you ever so much for your contributions to yourselves and to the speakers earlier. So thank you.
Good, and we look forward to hearing more in the autumn and to being able to participate. I'm very aware of the fact that it's now July and we've heard about an event happening in the middle of September, and August is a dead month for holding council meetings. So if there's anything that either the speakers would like to come back to myself or to you, Claire and Sean, on between now and then that we need to know and need to be working on to make sure that everything happens in September, I'm sure that I'm right in saying that we're all happy to hear and do our stuff, so that the speakers know that they're not going to be left in the dark now for 7 weeks.
Oh yeah, absolutely. We're working with One Planet York with the sustainability group, and we're working with York Environment Group on the York Environment Week, which is later September. So we're already on to those speakers, and the other two. I'm not sure where they came from, I'm afraid, but absolutely happy to help and support them if they've got any further questions.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much for that, and we'll move on. I'm just checking while you say that, Claire, the things that have been raised by the other speakers and making sure we haven't left anything behind. I think the points that were made by Jeff actually fit the next agenda item. Maybe
yeah, they do.
We've been discussing. And I think many of the points that were raised by Debbie, we have looked at and been responding to here. So I think we can wrap up this topic now and move on to the next agenda item. So the next agenda item is on page, and find my own way through all of this. Page 41, agenda item 5. So am I right in thinking you're introducing this one, Sean, as it's all the indicators and...
Unless Claire wants to give another quick overview, I'm happy to.
No, that's fine. You can go ahead. That's fine.
Great, thanks, Claire. Yeah, so one of the biggest drivers within the climate change strategy will be carbon reduction, decarbonisation, both of the city and of the council's corporate activities, as we clarified earlier in the minutes. And as hopefully we all know, the council made an ambition for the city net zero carbon by 2030. They also made a commitment within the council plan to publish data relating to carbon emissions across the city and CO2 emissions from the council's buildings and operations. And this paper addresses that commitment directly by assessing which KPIs we will be reporting and to fulfill that commitment. So first of all, when it comes to corporate emissions, we've suggested here a set of indicators that will standardise the reporting process for future years. Those suggested metrics include electricity consumption from our own buildings. And just a note here that since 2019, all electricity consumed in CYC's buildings is from 100% renewable sources, but it is best practice to dual report emissions, even if 100% of your electricity is renewable, and we will be doing that. The second indicator is emissions from gas from our own buildings. The third one is water consumption from our own buildings. We'll also be reporting emissions associated with corporate waste, emissions associated with our own fleet operation, emissions from business travel, and emissions from land use and carbon sequestration and offsetting as a result of tree planting currently underway by the council. Do you want me to pause there, Chair, and take questions on that element first, or shall I just move through?
Well, I think that might be a good idea, yes, because this is a very big thing, and there are a number of different charts. So do people have comments on what they've just heard there, and whether those KPIs, those performance indicators, are going to cover the areas we all expect to see covered, and that there aren't loopholes? Do people have thoughts on that? I suppose I can kick off just by saying one thing that strikes me from this list is that if we look at land use solely in terms of trees planted, that immediately makes me think of a topic that we've been had in this committee over the past year, of our verges and how we manage cutting verges, where, you know, if there isn't a key performance indicator here that is broad enough to factor that in, my fear would be that in a year's time we've not made any progress on gathering the arisings from the hundreds of miles of rural verge we've got, and using those arisings to create biogas and those kind of things that are part and parcel of our daily work as a city council, that might get lost if we just focus on one aspect of land use. So I'm just keen to hear what others think of that. I can see there are already two hands up. Before I go to you, Sean, see if other people have thoughts that you can then address all together. So I think it was Stuart first and then Anna.
Cheers, Christian. Yeah, completely agree with the point on land use. I was going to use the example of green space in my wards, which I've campaigned for some time on, and it's green space at jeopardy. So I think looking at, if we could maybe look again, as you say, at what might be the other useful indicators of sort of successful, sustainable land use. And the other point I was going to raise, which is a very minor one, but I think relevant. So the point on CYC fleet, you've then referenced in the comments that this will include a number of electric vehicles. If we could just sort of maybe reference alternative fuel. I mean, hydrogen for heavy goods is, there's a lot of discussion about it. And I think as a council, we have the potential, I've looked at this in some detail in the day job, there's no conflict here because there's no sort of pecuniary interest. But it's just a statement of fact that actually local authorities have a really important role to play as potential off-takers to kind of act as anchors to drive zero-emission fuel production. So I'd like us to be thinking about that rather than just electric. Quite a detailed point, but relevant, I think.
Yeah, no, and I'll ask Anna to contribute next, and then go back to you, Sean.
Thanks, Chair. I'll turn the video off and hopefully you can hear me. There were just a couple of things that I wanted to ask about, and I suppose the first is, and it's possibly just quibbling over language use, but it's this use of the phrase "an ambition for York to achieve net zero" rather than us having the commitment to do it. So I think it'd be good to, if we can sort of just bottom out why that changes. You know, is that a date for carbon neutrality for York or just CYC? And is it an ambition or is it a commitment for us as the council to be doing that? And my other one was, can we just get a little bit of extra clarity on sort of the corporate emissions versus citywide, because obviously we commission things elsewhere too, and how far sort of through the supply chain are we tracking back? And I guess that's a bit of a how long is a piece of string, but just in terms of sort of bigger contracts, are we following these through? Are we asking partners as routinely as part of that to report back to us on their own emissions, because it's something that we've sort of contracted out? So thank you. Hopefully you managed to get both of them, and I'll turn my video back on so you can see that I'm listening.
Thanks, Anna. So yes, Sean.
Yeah, great, brilliant comments. Thank you. Let's address them in turn. Councillor Vassie, Chair, your point on a broader metric for land use. Wherever we have the data available to us, we will report on the impact on emissions from land use. I suspect it would be quite difficult to capture the data for all of CYC's owned land and what its uses are and what it's currently used for, but wherever we can, we will do that. Councillor Barnes, yeah, great point. I think within the unit measure of our own fleet, there is a commitment there to report by fuel type as well, which will include whether that's electricity as a fuel or LPG or hydrogen or whatever the fuel type might be. We will definitely report on that. And then Councillor Perrott, I think that your question around whether it's an ambition or a commitment is probably not one that I can answer. That's one for councillors to answer, but I've taken the wording straight from the climate change declaration. So that's the ambition is what's stated in the declaration. And a great point around our influence. So this will cover both scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. So these are emissions that we're directly responsible for ourselves as a council, and also the emissions responsible associated with the electricity that we consume. It doesn't cover scope 3, but in point 14 around procurement and scope 3, it states that there is no reliable way of calculating our scope 3 emissions. We will look to address this in the future, and we are looking at the procurement policies that we have to make sure that we're trying to capture data from our suppliers and contractors on their carbon emissions so that we can report that in the future, and that will allow us to put policies programs in place to reduce carbon emissions associated with scope 3 activity.
Yes, Rachel, I'm seeing, and then Claire. I'm taking everything in the order I see it. That's okay. So.
Thanks. I just wanted to ask for some more information about that procurement policy review, like what the process for that is and the timescale and what it's going to include, please.
Oh yes, I'd have to speak with someone from procurement. My understanding is that there's a national public procurement review underway. I think there's a consultation happening at the moment, so we are expecting some changes soon anyway. But we've also been doing some work with the York and North Yorkshire Local Enterprise Partnership to produce a sustainable procurement template. And once the national review is completed, we'll see how we can feed in that sustainable procurement template into our own way of working. Sorry, I don't have timescales for you though, Councillor Millie.
Claire.
Thank you. I might be jumping the gun a little bit about citywide emissions, but Councillor Perrett did raise citywide emissions, so I think it's just worth mentioning. Sean and I have just established a sustainability leads group, which is where we've invited anchor institutions' own sustainability leads to come together and basically share and work together to reduce carbon across the city, recognising, of course, the council's not alone. We have several large employers, not least the hospital, the universities, and big ones like Aviva, etc. So we're all working together with the sustainability leads to try and tackle carbon emissions as a whole. And we are going to be sharing this framework with them to see if we can get some sense of sharing data, so we can get an understanding of whether we're actually able to sort of align and work together to see how our carbon is being reduced from an institutional level, and compare essentially apples with apples. Obviously, different institutions will have different drivers. So not everyone, if you take the university, for example, do they look at student travel, for example, as one of their emissions or not? I mean, that's entirely up to the university, but just understanding, I think, the impact of different institutions on the city will be really important.
Thank you. Yes, Rachel, yes. Comment on this point.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Isn't that supposed to be one of the roles of the Climate Commission? So bringing kind of sustainability leads from different major organisations and large employers together to kind of share ideas and best practice.
Yeah, we're taking a more operational perspective. So rather than necessarily setting the strategy, it's kind of what's it telling us and what are we going to do different as a result. It's much more grassroots, if you like. It's similar to the head of communications group that I ran prior to my role here, and it's more about kind of sharing insight and opportunity rather than necessarily setting strategy or wider opportunity.
Interesting. Okay, thanks.
It might be helpful to say that 4 weeks ago, maybe 4 weeks ago, I addressed a meeting of an National NHS committee, and was very surprised, and that's a reflection on me and my ignorance and not the NHS, at how incredibly focused they are on these issues now, and how knowledgeable the people were who were leading on this, and the amount of work that's going in to try and transform the NHS. And in fact, down to the point of actually learning the very significant reduction in carbon emissions that York Hospital has made over the past couple of years with its heating. So I certainly came away from that meeting with a promise from them that they'd be happy to come and talk to to a climate change committee meeting, and that they were very keen to see more integrated working between all the stakeholders, which seems to fit in with what you're saying there, Claire, and it's to be welcomed. If I've got a slight and I understand this is a difficult tension, but with this list of KPIs, performance indicators for corporate emissions, is that we want it on the one hand to be not too many things, because then it just becomes a blur of numbers that no one follows. On the other hand, that short list that we create will have the impact one way or another of having things drop beneath the radar. And it's how we balance that in order to achieve is really critical. And one of the things it makes me think of is that yesterday I heard, and this brought great joy to me, and I hope will bring kind of modest joy to others at least, after 17 years of pestering council officers, we are finally going to get a trial of a rubberized road surface in York. I'm delighted with that, because it will reduce, it reduces potholing around the world and will stretch our pothole budget further. But I'm also delighted about it because it will contribute to a circular economy, because they use shredded tires to create a rubber crumb surface that is then more impervious to water, which means that water doesn't penetrate the road and ice doesn't form and crack the surface, etc., etc. Beyond all of that, the actual process of laying a rubberized road surface reduces the carbon emissions of reducing that surface by 8%. So it's an example of something that doesn't fit all that neatly with the headlines that we're used to thinking about in terms of cutting carbon emissions, but nonetheless will have a significant impact. So I'd just like to hear your thoughts, Claire and Sean, on how you think that these key performance indicators will, on the one hand, help, and on the other hand, run the risk of letting things slip beneath the radar, and how we make sure that doesn't happen. Sorry if that's very complex and convoluted.
No, that's fine, Chair. Thank you. I think one of the ways they will help is through being published on the York Open Data platform. So there's an element of accountability, of visibility of how the council is performing there, and that can also be utilised by city partners, by organisations, and indeed by individuals to scrutinise the data and hopefully ask questions not just about what data is presented, but like you've just done, ask questions around what data isn't there. The example you gave would be captured under our Scope 3 procurement emissions, which we're not going to publish at the moment because of the challenges of acquiring that data and the reliability of that data. But it's something that like I've said, we will look to do in the future.
Okay, thank you for that. Are there any other comments, or should we move on from this section? I'm conscious that some people might be approaching D-Day on an event later on, some may not. So if we can just, I'm not seeing anyone with more comments on that, so I'll let you carry on, Sean, and move on to the next part of the paper.
Thank you, Chair. So yeah, the second part of the report looks at citywide emissions, which are a far more complex matter, which was articulated actually very well by one of the public speakers, Jeff Beacon, who described the challenges around citywide emissions reporting. That presently there are a number of data sources that can be used to measure citywide emissions. Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy published data, Friends of the Earth published data, and a range of other organisations published data annually around citywide emissions. What we're looking to do is utilise what's considered the most reliable and complete information source, and from the research that we've done, that seems to be the scatter tool. And apologies, I realised I've used an acronym without explaining the meaning of the acronym. Scatter stands for Setting City Area Targets and Trajectories for Emissions Reduction. Scatter, the benefits of Scatter are that it is an internationally recognised framework, and so reporting using the Scatter tool is compliant with the reporting standards of both the Global Covenant of Mayors Common Reporting Framework and the Carbon Disclosure Project, both of which we reported to last year for the first time as a city. The other benefits for Scatter are that it's free to use for all local authorities in the UK, and the fact that over 320 local authorities in the UK are currently using it. So it's a great benchmarking tool as well for comparing our own local authority performance with others across the country. The indicators that compile Scatter are presented there in the table. As you'll see, there's a whole raft of indicators that cover broad sectors of energy, transport, waste, industrial process, product use, land use, and generation of grid supplied energy. The full data set isn't complete for York, and there is further work to do to refine the data set, but we've concluded that is the best currently available. And again, we will be publishing all of the data on the York Open Data platform, again, to increase visibility, accountability, but to also allow our partners to scrutinise the data and identify potential areas for improvement from themselves and our own performance as well.
I have to say I'm hugely impressed, Sean, that we're picking something that is recognised internationally and is used by 300 local authorities, because one of the biggest challenges is bound to be in the years ahead comparators, viable, useful comparators with our neighbours, with other municipalities, with other cities and other countries. So I think that's hugely to be welcomed. What other thoughts do members have on the list that we're presented here? While you're thinking, I'll make a couple of other comments that I've scribbled down, and one relates to how we're reporting all of this going forwards. So these indicators and whatever, and just to note that I'm hoping that very quickly this council will reach a point where every report, when it reaches the last page, as we have on page 45 in this document, includes under implications with financial, HR and legal, crime and disorder and whatever, climate change, carbon emissions, so that we start actually having that measured, quantified understanding of the implications of everything we do in every department. And I hope that's the direction of travel. And am I right in thinking that the data that we're going to be collecting here will be the key to being able to do this as we move forwards?
Yes, it will be a combination of both of those elements that we've discussed in this report. So both our corporate emissions and our citywide emissions. The challenge we have, Chair, I guess, is that there is an inherent time lag between when the emissions are generated and when we have the data on those emissions. Most, in fact, all emissions inventories are published at least 2 years prior to when those emissions were generated. So the latest we can report on this year are emissions for the city from 2018. That's just an inherent time lag around the methodology of collecting the data, but just something to be aware of as well.
Yeah. I mean, do you think going forwards that this council might usefully, the full council might usefully declare a desire to encourage the government to change the way in which data is exchanged as part and parcel of moving us forwards? Because plainly, if we're waiting 2 years for data, when data is actually being collected in real time in many places, thanks to smart technology, it's not really helping us in this battle. I suppose it's not really a question for you, Sean. I suppose it's really a question for all of us as elected members to be thinking, you know, is that something that this city council should be acting to persuade government to engage with differently? Yes, rather than trying to force you to answer that question, it's probably totally inappropriate, Sean. I'll ask Anna to, you've got your hand up, Anna.
Thanks, Chair. I was going to ask similar questions about the annual reporting and that 2-year lag, because there would be obvious benefits, wouldn't there, if we could have almost real-time data, or if we could at least see it on a quarterly basis to see when there are those sort of pressures, if sort of tourism's a contributing factor in terms of sort of hospitality retail sector, which I can imagine it would put additional pressure on, but I think it'd be good from a systems point of view to understand that better. So fingers crossed, yeah, as the Chair mentioned, we'd get better at doing that and having that smart data. So I suppose moving on from that, scope 3, as part of scatter, obviously there's, yeah, technical challenges around how we actually measure this then, Sean. I don't know if you can sort of explain how we'll be capturing it through scatter, if at the minute the tool isn't sort of necessarily potentially sophisticated enough to help us do this. Is that, are there plans to improve it? Because I got the impression from your earlier answer about this that it's maybe not quite there yet.
Yeah, exactly that, actually. And one of the other strengths I should have mentioned of the scatter tool, that it's actively being maintained, monitored and improved by the designers as well, that they still have an active involvement of it. So it's being improved all the time. The majority of scope 3 emissions that are included within scatter are best estimates of data that's available. But as we've discussed, as kind of the technology improves and becomes a greater enabler, there'll be a higher degree of accuracy around that information, a higher degree of certainty and a wider collecting process as well. So we'll have not just more data, but better, more accurate data over the years.
Are there any other comments? Another thing springs to mind for me. I've just been attending a whole string of meetings of the North Yorkshire Pension Fund Committee. And what I'm certainly trying to do on behalf of York is to move us towards cutting the carbon emissions of our pension fund. That doesn't appear obviously here in our corporate emissions, but it forms a part of our corporate emissions. And so it's another example that comes to mind of, once we've got our carbon pathway, those emissions will be a part of that pathway and how we reduce those emissions of our pension fund in a more, and to show what we're doing positively in that context. We're at a point now where the pension pool, of which York is a member, along with 11 other local authorities, is now moving towards giving us a responsible investment dashboard, which will include carbon cost of all the investments that we have. So I suppose it's a last question, I suppose, from me, is when we start communicating this movement towards a zero carbon pathway, are we yet thinking about the graphics, the communication of that, so that it's done with clarity in a way that doesn't involve us getting lost in huge swathes of, knee deep in facts and figures, but presents it in a dashboard format that enables the decision makers and the committees and members to understand our progress, and residents and stakeholders to understand the progress we're making, say, on a quarterly basis going forwards. Are we heading in that direction? Are we talking about that already?
Sean, do you want to come in there, or shall I? I'll give a little summary, and then Sean can pick up the details. So yes, absolutely. We've talked about essentially, we're calling it a single version of the truth, but we can call it whatever we like, which essentially brings everything together and helps us all understand what's going on a single page, or maybe a couple of pages, just to make a real kind of snapshot of the different activities that are going on across the council and the impact they're having. Because it is difficult to get your arms around everything. So the easier we can make it for everyone, actually, the easier we can have kind of more mature and helpful conversations. Sean, over to you.
Thanks, Claire. Yeah, I was just going to add that I think Council of this is the first step towards that ambition. This standardises the reporting process. It standardises the information collection so that we avoid those situations of multiple numbers being out and available to the public and creating that level of confusion. We can, off the back of this, then create that standardized presentation format that creates that consistency. But just the point that this data is published annually, so it would most likely be an annual presentation of the data rather than quarterly.
Thank you for that. Thank you. And is it going to be technically too challenging to produce quarterly reports, or is that something that we might be in? That presumably relies on real-time data, and what you've told us so far is that the data isn't coming quickly enough for us to be able to do things more regularly. Am I understanding that correct?
Precisely, yeah. Until the data capture becomes automated through enabling technologies, it's presently extremely labour intensive and laborious. And yeah, that's primarily the reason why it's only available annually.
Yeah, I mean, to maybe for anyone who's looking in, and to give further clarity on how this relates to the pension fund, and bearing in mind the Climate Change Committee had a big debate on divestment and carbon emissions in March last year. One of the big dynamics in communicating with the public is that the public is acting in the dark And quite often people are saying, well, what are the carbon emissions? What are your investments in fossil fuels? And so on and so forth, and coming up with figures that are largely computations made by well-intentioned people who don't have access to data. And then they're responded to by the institution that equally doesn't have access to the data, but is sure that whatever it's being told is an exaggeration. And the sooner we get to a point where we can have confidence that there's genuine data, the sooner that debate will become more intelligent and more constructive, and the sooner we'll be moving in, be able to demonstrate we're going somewhere. So I think the parallels, for me anyway, from the various hats I've got, the parallels seem quite clear. Anna, you've got another point you'd like to make or a question you'd like to make?
I have, thanks, Chair. I'll try and leave the video on this time. It was around sort of how we set the baseline. So I suppose, especially for the corporate side of things, we know the end target, don't we? So are we using the sort of this year as a baseline, and then are we going to set targets per year for in-year reductions, sort of potentially increasing, or is that going to come out as part of any kind of action planning that sits beneath the strategy? I think it'd just be good if we knew, I suppose, how things are going to be measured and communicated to us, because the numbers don't necessarily mean anything if it's a standalone annual amount, if we're not comparing and contrasting and seeing sort of how much percentage wise we should be targeting each year. Just thinking it's always easier to read your own performance figures if it's that red rag kind of rating, and, you know, just thinking of easiness for us and everybody else, just to be able to see that we're actually on target. So how are we setting those? Are we setting targets per year?
So yes, Sean, you pick up on the targets per year, and I can pick up on the how we share the information.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Claire. So from a baseline perspective, so the last time we reported our corporate emissions, if I remember correctly, was 2015, but we do have data going back to 2005, I think, for that. So either of those points, well, 2005 would most likely be our baseline from corporate emissions, but there might be a question around what data was used to capture that information. And so from a consistency approach, I would suggest kind of re-establishing a baseline this year with the data that we gather through this methodology, the KPIs that are presented in this paper. From a citywide perspective, last year was the first time that we used the scatter tool to calculate citywide emissions. So again, I would suggest that would be the most useful piece of information to use for a city baseline. And for monitoring performance going forward, one of the pieces of work we'll be doing as part of the strategy is identifying the carbon reduction pathway that will get us to or close to our net zero carbon ambition by 2030. So we will have an annual pathway that we can monitor performance against.
And just to add to that, so you asked how we'll know during the course of the year whether we're on or off target and how we're contributing to that. The single version of the truth, or whatever we call it, will identify those activities taking place throughout the year that contribute towards that. So just as Councillor Vassie talked about the rubberised roads, we've talked about other opportunities. We'll make sure that we capture them through the actual reporting cycle. So somebody mentioned about making sure the implications are laid out as a as part of carbon reduction at the bottom of the report. The decision-making reports will capture all of that and we'll summarise it. Now, it'll all be predictive, of course, because we won't actually have the data to support it until later on, but it will provide a kind of indicative amount of how we are nibbling away, if you like, at that target, so you can see the different projects that contribute to it overall.
The Climate Change Committee has been clear from very early on, and I'm really proud of all the work that everyone did, that the creation of a zero carbon pathway is absolutely essential, because without having a goal and a series of steps, you're not going anywhere. And I'm reminded of the fact, or I was reminded last week, that last year carbon emissions globally apparently dropped 7%. As the pandemic bit. And the reality is, if we're going to hit our target, carbon emissions have to reduce by 7% every year from here on in. And that is the daunting scale of the challenge that faces us. But once we quantify it and face up to it and start delivering projects that contribute to a measured, quantified target, we're on our way to delivering something. Where we've been in the past of just saying, well, we're doing something and we're a leading place because we've done a lot this year, we're like everyone else, not going anywhere. Now we're close to having a pathway. I feel that we're beginning the real journey. It's going to be very tough. It's going to be expensive. But if we can take all the information that Claire's just spoken about and Sean has spoken about, the things we do in a given year, and we add them up and we show what we've done and we communicate that effectively with all the stakeholders, with businesses and with residents, then we'll reach the place where people will start to have confidence that we can do this thing. And the more confidence we have that we are actually achieving something, the more likely we are to deliver it. So I think we've kind of, I don't know if anyone has any other thoughts on this agenda item at the moment. I'm happy to hear them, but I think we've given it a good airing, and I'm proud that we're creating this zero carbon pathway. And I hope that the measurements we're going to take enable us to quantify the steps we make and then to communicate it effectively. And then I hope that all of us, residents and stakeholders and members, can feel confident, and officers, that we are actually delivering a future that we want to see. Unless anyone has any other thoughts they'd like to make, I think I'd like to wrap it up, because I think I'm really pleased that the report has come forward. We've had a good discussion on it, and I'm glad that progress is being made, and wish everyone a good August, and hope we can hit the ground running in September and carry on the good work. I can't see anyone else itching to say anything, so I'll thank everyone for your attendance, and look forward to seeing you all soon. Bye now.